Hello, my name is Kayong, and today I'll be presenting on Toni Morrison's Desdemona and how her narrative successfully provides a feminist reconciliation. To start with a table of contents, you could see that this is the order how the presentation will be proceeded. So, Toni Morrison's Desdemona is an innovative rewriting of Othello in which the originally silenced wife of Othello is given agency to redefine her narrative and life. While the play originates from Shakespeare's canonical text, Morrison introduces questions of race, gender, and most importantly, the possibility of an alternative society through her reinterpretation. Considering that Desdemona was planned to be staged in response to Peter Sellers' earlier production of Othello, and that Sellers himself directed Desdemona, the play clearly seeks to establish a meaningful dialogue not only with Shakespeare's original but also with a modern reinterpretation engaging with urgent social concerns. As is widely known, Toni Morrison is an eminent writer who developed one of the most significant Black American literary traditions through works such as Beloved and The Bluest Eye. As her master's thesis suggests, her literary interests range from Woolf to Faulkner, indicating her ability to engage with both feminist narrative and specifically American forms of abjection. This background is important for understanding her work as it provides insight into how her characters confront the contradictions that shape their identities, as well as the tragic dynamics that emerge among characters situated in different loci of alienation. Desdemona perfectly encapsulates Morris's poetics in this sense. Taking place in an afterlife that is ambiguous enough to perceive as both ubiquitous and nowhere at once, the play stages a post-mortem dialogue following the bloodshed of Othello, thus functioning as a kind of eulogy and afterword. Yet, as Desdemona declares in the play, "We will never die again," the work feels strikingly hopeful, as if is still something to be salvaged from the already doomed world of Shakespeare's Othello and from the once silenced voice of Desdemona. This raises an important question. From where does Morrison conjure the sense of optimism in her retelling of a tragedy that has already passed? What power does this ambiguous afterlife possess, and how does it reflect reality? To understand this possibility of reconciliation, we must first examine how the vision operates within the living world. Thus, in this presentation, I aim to address these questions by suggesting that Desdemona's reconciliation gestures towards the possibility of a more inclusive feminist society for the next generation. While there is much to analyze in the work, I will focus on the relational dynamics among the characters within a homosocial framework in order to demonstrate how these relationships both construct and destabilize gender binaries and ultimately make possible Desdemona's vision of reconciliation and a more inclusive feminist nature. To briefly clarify the theoretical framework, I use homosociality to refer to social bonds structured along same sex relations, particularly those that reinforce gendered hierarchies. While the term is most commonly applied to male centered structures, this presentation also considers female homosocial dynamics, both as a site of resistance and as a negative mirror image of existing power relations, in order to suggest the possibility of a more inclusive social formation. Although homosociality originates as a sociological concept dominantly, I argue that it provides a particularly effective lens for analyzing Morrison's context-rich work in my perspective. Before we delve into the idea of gender dichotomy in Desdemona, a fundamental question must be posed. How does one recognize a dichotomous relationship? Is it determined by the two subjects themselves or by the standard that produces the division in the first place? To this question, I propose the premise that binary oppositions are not inherent, but that they emerge only after the act of division itself. Accordingly, I would like to examine Desdemona's homosocial structures by focusing on how each character attempts to claim agency and drawing the boundaries of their preferred community. As Erickson has also pointed out, Morrison's Desdemona brings to the forefront what had been relatively understated in the original work. Othello's primary, quote, allegiance to Iago, which is demonstrated on stage when Othello confesses to Desdemona that he had raped two elderly women. What is particularly significant here is that it's not only the shared nature of the crime, but also the way in which Othello narrates it, as quote, "You don't understand. We are not only refusing to kill our own memory, but insisting on his life in another." To such testimony, Iago and Othello's brotherhood is not only affirmed by Othello, but also proceeds to override the relationship he builds with Desdemona. Of course, such an analysis has already been very eloquently provided by Erikson, but I would like to add that this speech of Othello serves not simply as a confession brought forth to transfer male power into the center of marriage for Desdemona's subordination, as quote Erikson, but rather a means of othering or excluding the feminine subjects from the male homo society. Note that Othello's confession begins at the newlywed couple's bed, a place of innocence and privacy warranted by lawful guidance. As Desdemona quotes that she was captured by the love and the prospect of inhabiting a broad original world, albeit problematic in terms of fetishizing Othello's race in some respect, promptly before the confession begins, the wedding bed is a highly personalized erotic sphere where every expression or action towards the other is implicative of one's desire and sexuality. In this perspective, Othello's testimony of sexual plunder is eminently connected to his current accompaniment of Desdemona. The marital legality of their sexual act serves as the reverse mirror image of his crime, or the act of slacking thirst of our loins, as he quotes, where Desdemona is forced to be iterated into the witness by listening to his reenactment of a past crime, as well as the woman whom he has intercourse with as a mode of boasting masculine power. And as Othello explains, his confession carries not only shame but pleasure in the degradation that he and Iago had caused, and more pleasure in leaving a witness to it. Thus, the confession develops into a speech that is closer to a declaration to justify and publicize his obscenity that was committed in secrecy, an act that does not simply put forth homo society in the center of marriage, but rather exiles the privacy of marriage to the public for the sake of a more degrading pleasure that lies underneath the secret language men speak in public. Here, the language of love, which Othello employs to share his publicized secret, is the mode which serves to emphasize the bond by trivializing itself, as quoted in Othello's accusation of Desdemona being illusioned with love as choosing the ripe and discarding the rot. The now publicized and trivialized relationship with Othello and Desdemona is an emotional transaction which Othello demands it to be complete and whole despite its costs. Subordination indeed is required by Othello, but it is not for the means for preserving their marital harmony, but rather as the acknowledgement of the prominent divide between the homosocial world of Othello and Desdemona's entrapped feminine world sustained with exotic fetishizations, or so accuses Othello. In any way, it is affirmable that the gender dichotomy primarily drawn by Othello indicates the acknowledgement of the divide, not even requiring a need to identify the world of his counterpart. Although the initial formation of gender dichotomy does not explicitly define a feminine homosocial structure, such a structure remains identifiable within the play. It is quite clear that Desdemona, too, had constructed a solid notion of a feminine community throughout her life. Yet what is notable about Desdemona's female community is that it serves as a means to escape from her status quo, rather than of Othello's usage of his homo society to consolidate his social status. In other words, Desdemona's homo society consists not of women that she meets in her social clique, but those whom she finds to be equally confined, as she quotes. I join the underwater women, stroll with them in the dark light. I exist in places where I can speak. Mystique and mystical as such a quote may seem, Desdemona's world begins from a desolate image of repression. Note this quote: the word Desdemona means misery. Men made the rules, women followed them. A step away was doom, indeed, and misery without relief. One of the memories constituting her childhood is of her being restrained from swimming with the swans, subsequently being warned that my desires, my imagination must remain hidden. Indirectly referable to the Western mythology trope of Leda's intercourse with the swan and her sexual emancipation, Desdemona's early sexual curiosity is restrained by a parental authority, hence the rejection she is born into and the discouragement of her native culture. Desdemona's deficiency is thus fulfilled with her bond with Barbary, her nurse. I'd like to mention in advance that Barbary's true name, which is Saran, will be revealed later, and for my later part of the presentation, I will be referring to her as Saran. So by telling Barbary her stories of other lives, places where gods speak in sundering silence and mimic human faces and forms, Barbary's foreign narrative introduces Desdemona to the possibility of freedom that she had been initially rejected by her patriarchal authorities, which can be resembled by both her parents and her culture. What is notable here is that Desdemona not only exploited the exotic nature of her nurse, but considered Barbary as her birth mother, a subject that comforts and danced with her for her recovery. In this dynamic, the traditional mother to daughter relationship neglected in the Western patriarchy is reinvigorated, deeming the motherly figure as containing shamanistic healing powers derived from nature. And while Barbary's death shortly after alienates young Desdemona, fate does not hinder her from pursuing her nurse's legacy. Barbary's heart, described as wide as it was, proved vulnerable, becomes another striking element of femininity that Desdemona remembers through her life. As she watches her second mother stumble up under the spell of her lover, Barbary forever remains as the mystical and instinctive figure that urges Desdemona to love the idea of love. Her future encounter with Othello is hence romanticized as she saw a glint of brass in his eyes, identical to the light in Barbary's eyes, implying both a mildly homoerotic warning of the lost mother and conjuring of the dead by exploiting Othello's physicality. This suggests that Barbary's figure operates not merely as a memory but as a foundational structure through which Desdemona reimagines femininity outside patriarchal constraints. While Desdemona's notion of femininity has different outlooks from Othello's masculine society, note that both imagined communities have strong ties to what they believe to be as primordial instincts of male or female. Ties to instinctiveness make both characters' choices seem inevitable and natural, their divide of femininity and masculinity justified in the same context. While Desdemona asserts her idea of a feminine homo society as an alternative to the repressive and violent patriarchy, it is quite clear that her community might be just as biased as Othello's. What is now necessary is understanding how Desdemona realizes the flaws of her alternative community and what she proposes as an enhancement. Fortunately, the afterworld serves as a deconstructive mediator for a proper discourse that had not been possible in Othello. The most evident example here will be the dialogue between Desdemona and Saran, where Saran revokes Desdemona's claim of their bond. She coldly tells her that they shared nothing, that you don't even know my name. Barbary is the name of those without whom you could neither live nor prosper. Saran further criticizes Desdemona for naively ignoring their racial differences. I am black-skinned, you're white-skinned, she quotes. That brought her to forcible subordination, that every motherly activities that she had bestowed upon her was neither natural nor instinctual, but under the artifice of slavery. Another criticism arises from the dialogue between Emilia and Desdemona, where it is exposed that Desdemona's envisioning of a feminist utopia is only possible for the privileged. Unpin me, Emilia. Arrange my beds, she's Emilia. That is not how you treat a friend. That's how you treat a servant beneath your class, which takes devotion for granted. This is the quote from Emilia in the play, and as such, Desdemona's expectation of maternal commitment is once again exposed to be something that she had falsely fantasized to be universal amongst all women, while what she had received had been adamant acts of servitude. Such introductions of the new voices spark a discourse that challenges the forcibly enacted notion of the utopian society defined by Desdemona. What Desdemona had believed to be distinct from the patriarchal community has also been functioning under hidden power dynamics, her plea for instinctual bond proving to be just as artificial and toxic as what Othello had shared with Iago. Yet Morrison devised the afterlife as the central setting of the play, not in the sole purpose of crushing Desdemona's dreams. Instead, the disillusionment of a distorted utopia is simply a step towards a more hopeful future Desdemona can envision. This is so because the core mechanism of the afterlife is not about unilateral confrontations to the truth, but a set where unfulfilled dialogue finally takes place. Take, for example, the conversation between Sune and Madame Barbantiu, the mothers of Othello and Desdemona. Upon meeting each other in a cave-like setting, the two women are revealed to have been grieving for their children's deaths. As they realize that they had been in-laws in their past lives, they fall into a conflicting situation where each question themselves if they are enemies for their cause of sorrow. However, the two mothers' conversation eventually develops into a ritual as they bond over the grief of how their children both died in and for love. Soon then introduces Madame Barbantiu to her traditional cleansing of diluting the poisons life forces us to swallow, to which Madame Barbantiu heeds. Short but powerful, this initial scene of the afterlife is symbolic because it stages the most impossible encounter, as the two women in real life would have never been able to even meet each other. Furthermore, Sune and Madame Barbantiu are what Desdemona would have considered polar opposite in her classification, as Madame Barbantiu was characterized as the strict, grim-faced avatar of patriarchy who initiated her journey of misery, while Sune would have been the perfect embodiment of her mother figure, as foretold by Othello. Yet the two mothers' dialogue indicates that the two extremely polarized women unite so easily under their common grief. In their allegiance, they are neither strict saints nor an exotic goddess, but a vulnerable human being who pleads to their own gods for help when their child is in danger. It is particularly this power of unforeseen potentials that Saran refers to in explaining her concept of the afterlife. As she says, afterlife is time, and with time there is change. My song is new. While the afterlife retains memories of loss and strife, remains of hierarchy, and people in pain, there is one thing that grants what was unavailable in the life before time. With the demolition of the restrictive temporality, individuals are finally able to think out of the box, as Desdemona quotes. If we haven't secured the passionate peace we yearn for, it is because we haven't imagined it. It is through her reconciliation with Saran that Desdemona learns her nurse's true name. The first, she acknowledges Saran as a woman tormented as equally as herself and embraces the humanity of her love sickness that had been glorified long after her death. While still embarking on Desdemona's initial idea of commitment and understanding, the afterworld succeeds in realizing her imaginary community into something viable and active. In this context, it is inferable that Morrison's notion of afterlife is a beautiful analogy of a feminist utopia where the dead and the alive, the colonized and the colonizer, the rich and the poor, and even men and women recite their own limited narrative to get to a better understanding of each other's lives. I would like to end the presentation with the following quote: "We will be judged by how well we love in Desdemona." And this is exactly the point where the bittersweet ending feels hopeful even to the living readers. While absolute transcendence is impossible in reality, the figure of earnestly listening to the narrative of the other and to commit to them in shared human emotions is what will let us be heard. So this will be the end of my presentation, and I've also prepared some questions that you might want to look at for further discussions with your friends. And here are the references that I looked at while preparing my presentation. So thank you for your time and attention.